Paging Student Doctor.
So, how are you doing today?
I am good. I'm getting settled into Michigan, and it is fantastic here.
Oh, that's nice. So, I wanted us to start by first introducing ourselves so our listeners could know who we are and, where we are right now in life or in med school.
Okay. So I'm Brooke Johnson. I am an incoming third-year medical student at ATSU-KCOM. So I've completed my first 2 years in Kirksville, Missouri, and now I'm getting settled in the Detroit area here in Michigan to start my third year. But during my first 2 years of med school, I was highly involved in my local community as well as in research. So hopefully today I'll be able to provide you all with some more insight into how to get started in research and how to hopefully boost your chances of matching into residency.
Great. And my name is Kalu Igwe. I'm an incoming second-year student at ATSU University, Kirksville College of Osteopathic Medicine, and I'm going to be interviewing Brooke today. All right, so we're going to start with the first question, which is what a lot of people usually think of. How important is research for medical students?
That's a good question. And before we get going, I just want to say that all of my answers are strictly based off of my own personal experience. So others may have various views on the topic, but these are just my experiences from the wide variety of research projects I had at ATSU, as well as before med school as well. But overall, I think research is becoming increasingly more important in medical school, primarily because the expectations to get into medical school are increasing, as well as those to get into residency programs. So I think if you're thinking of moving into a specialty that's deemed more competitive, such as ortho, general surgery, and those kind of things, then research is essentially critical to your application.
So when would you think we should start research then, if it's very important?
Okay, so from personal experience, I'm very huge on joining research projects that you're passionate about. So overall, I feel like there's such a push to join research. However, I think at the end of the day, when you interview for residency programs, and once again, that's not something I have done yet, but the residency directors and interviewers want to see your eyes light up when you talk about projects you've been involved in, whether that's research, volunteering, etc. So I would never do something just to boost your CV, but to do something you are passionate about and interested in, because at the end of the day, they're going to be able to see that when you talk about the topic. But I personally got started in research my first year, second semester. And so how my journey started is I approached the director of our gross anatomy course, Dr. Hauser, and I had a conversation with him about my interest in joining research. And he was very helpful in guiding me along my path and helping me determine that gross anatomy projects were where my interest was versus bench work. So I think oftentimes when people think about research, they think about the bench work. And for me, that's not something I'm interested in. So I geared my projects towards anatomy and things like that. But ultimately, he had me come up with my own research project and we hit the ground running from there. And over time, he saw my passion for research. I witnessed it myself and he invited me to join some other projects. So that's a great way in just getting your foot in the door for research is approaching a director or someone you look up to at your own institution or even outside of your institution. And hopefully if you do well on one project, they might invite you to join some others.
Okay, great. That was very helpful. The problem is some DO schools have limited research opportunities. So what would you suggest for students at these schools, especially if they're interested in a specialty-specific research and, like you mentioned, doing something you're passionate about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So overall, it's all about not being scared to take a chance. So I think as a first year, you kind of get caught up in what's expected of you. You're trying to keep your head above water, complete all of the required classes, and do well in them ultimately so that we can best serve our future patients. But I just had to take the jump in talking to someone that I looked up to a lot. And for me, that was Dr. Hauser, who I felt was very knowledgeable about what our institution offered, because I didn't know that ATSU-KCOM was a large research institution in the field of osteopathic med schools until I spoke with Dr. Hauser. And so, for those who may not know what their institution has, just take the step in approaching someone at your university and see what research opportunities that there might be. I know that not everyone gets to start their own research project like I had the opportunity to do, and that's completely okay. But I know a lot of professors have research projects in various domains as well as admission. So sometimes the admin at your school may have like public health opportunities or ways that they've been studying possible ways to improve the curriculum. So things like that. You just never know what your institution has until you take the step and talk.
Okay, let's say in general, you're not too sure of what you want to pursue, but you want to do research because you want to be competitive in the future for matching. So what should you do instead?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. Find a course that you're interested in. So if you really love microbiology, you don't have to have a specific topic in mind, but go talk to those professors to hear about what specific projects they're doing. And if you find one interesting and you find yourself going home and looking up some facts about their research and doing a little small lit review, then maybe pursue that. But if you find yourself loving gross anatomy, then talk to those professors and see what projects they're on.
Okay. And I have another question. So what if I'm interested in the field of radiology, but there's very few radiology researchers available? What should I do then to make them understand that I'm passionate about radiology, but I just don't have those opportunities?
Another opportunity for research is writing case studies. So that's where, if you're a didactic student, so you're in your first or second year, you can speak with physicians, whether they're at your institution or outside of that, and ask if they have any interesting cases that they've seen and if they would like any help writing those up. So that's an option. But if you're a third or fourth year student on rotations, you have the opportunity to write up unique cases that you're seeing in the clinic or in the hospital, as long as you have the approval of your surrounding physicians and care team as well as the patient.
And another question, what if a student was unable to pursue research during their first 2 years of medical school and maybe now they're in their clinicals? Is it still possible for them to pursue research at that time?
Definitely. I don't think that there's ever really a time that you're cut off from doing research. I mean, your time is going to change throughout your 4 years of medical school. I know personally, first year, first semester, I was just trying to adjust to medical school. And so it wouldn't have been reasonable for me to have joined a project then. Whereas second semester, first year, I had more free time. I had become way more confident and comfortable with medical school. So I had more time that I could set aside. And so moving on into my third year, I'm not too sure about how much time I'll have yet, but maybe once I get more comfortable and confident in that role, then I can allow more time to research as well. But I know some institutions do what we call a fellowship year. So that's something I did. But essentially, what that is you finish your first 2 years of medical school, and then you take a pause before starting your third year. And so within this year, you become a teacher and a mentor for the first and second year students. So personally, I did a medical education fellowship. And so my responsibilities were tutoring in every single course outside of OMM, anatomy, histology, and pathology. And I also had additional time to focus on research or any volunteer opportunities that I would like to pursue. And so I used my time during that year to focus on a lot of research projects that I had started before the fellowship, as well as add on some more research projects as well. So that's an option depending on your institution.
That sounds like an amazing opportunity. And speaking of time allotment, how could medical students make sure they're effectively making time for their studies and also balancing research at the same time?
That is a big question. I always focused on three things when it came to medical school. So, one was always my course load and making sure that that was my number one priority because while grades can be important, at the end of the day, we're studying to be future physicians. And I wanted to know that information for my future patients and to better their patient care. But secondly, for me, it was important to do research, not only because I'm considering general surgery, but because I found a passion and a love for research. So during my first and second year in medical school, I believe I only had one research project at that time. And then during the fellowship year, I was working on 5 to 6 research projects at a time. So once again, that would be unrealistic for students to do 5 to 6 projects their first or second year, whereas 1 to 2 projects might be more realistic depending on the student. Thirdly, my other priority was volunteer opportunities. So I was president of a free clinic at my institution. So overall, that was what was important to me. Whereas your priorities, Rose, may be different depending on where your interests lie, but also what you're considering pursuing in the future for residency. So ultimately, I would stay focused on about 3 priorities and go from there. And if research is one of them, fantastic. If not, then that's okay too.
And now that you mentioned it, there are some students who have told me they do not enjoy research. So, what would you say to the students that can they still successfully match without it?
I've spoken with a lot of fourth year students or have friends who are current interns, and some of them haven't done research. And ultimately, the priorities of the residency programs are going to vary. And it's also going to vary based off what specialty you're considering. Residency programs want someone who's well rounded. And so there are other ways to be well rounded outside of research.
Okay, thank you so much, Brooke. Today has been super insightful. I learned a lot from our question and our discussion.
Of course. Thank you, Rose.
All right, take care, and I wish you the best of luck with third year and hope you successfully match into your specialty of choice.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye. We have Dr. Young here with us. He is a professor and a researcher at ATSU, and I'm just going to ask him to introduce himself so we can know more about him and his work.
My pleasure. I am a professor of anatomy. I am the course director for the neuroscience course. I primarily lecture in neuroanatomy, but also in clinical basis of embryology. Most of my research involves neurosurgery and a complex of math and physics to anatomical system.
That's really nice to hear. And I'm curious, so what do your lab do? Like, is there something you guys do specifically every year, or do you switch it up every year?
Every experiment and every project is different. So we do something different every year.
And how do students assist?
Well, it depends on the project. I try to make sure that every student doing research in my lab gets a lot of hands-on experience. So my students do neurosurgery with me. They do a variety of surgery, a lot of anatomical preparations, both microscopic and gross. About the only thing that they don't do in my lab is much to do with the math and the physics. For me, my research projects almost overwhelmingly are part of a bigger research program I'm doing. So in that way, when I do a specific research project, I get to advance my big research program. The students aren't part of the bigger research program because they typically work for me for 1 or 2 years. My research programs lasting decades, for better or worse. I'm at a point of my career where a publication doesn't make any real difference. And what I mean by that is, as tenure, the university really has no means of rewarding me. That's not the case for a student. A publication makes a big difference for a student.
That was very insightful. And if students were interested in joining a lab like yours, how would you want them to approach you?
Oh, most of the time they just drop by. They send me an email, they come in. The research students that are currently working in my lab are pretty good about bringing in their mentees or friends of theirs in the first year that they've identified that they think would be a good fit. And I think there's enough word of mouth going on at what I do. I unfortunately, I generally have to turn away far more students than I can take.
Okay. So now we're just going to ask some other questions. Like, how important is research for medical students?
Well, it is not a requirement of the institution. Okay? I think in a practical sense, it is a requirement. And I think that's because on a couple levels. Number one, if you're a medical student and you're going on into a career of medicine, you're going to be a lifelong consumer of research. And to do that effectively, you've really got to understand it. And I don't think there's any real way of understanding research without doing it. The other issue is, especially in modern times, now that the accreditation and other processes associated with MD and DO programs are rapidly merging, what our students are finding is that the competition for rotation sites and all sorts of competitive slots, they're now competing not only with DO students, but in many cases with MD students. And it's becoming increasingly common for one of the main metrics that they're being evaluated under is, have you done research? So to be a competitive applicant, particularly in some disciplines, like neurosurgery now, if you don't have some research hubs, you're never going to get good rotation slots and good residencies. But it's becoming more and more common even at the non kind of hyper competitive subdisciplines. So in that sense, to really ensure that you have some say in the path you want going forward, I would say research is a practical requirement.
Okay. And when do you think students should start engaging in research, or at least medical students?
For me, in my lab, and I think this is true for most of the faculty, we're a little leery about having first-year students come into our lab. It is such an enormous transition in workload, going from any undergraduate program, going to your first year of medical school. We don't want the demands of time of doing research to interfere with that. We want the students to find their way to prosper in their first year. They've got to learn new study techniques. It's a whole settling process. I don't want to interfere with that for the student to get research. So like most of my colleagues, I encourage the student to start doing research the summer between their first and second year.
Okay. And many DO schools have limited research opportunities. So what would you suggest for students at this school, especially if they're interested in specialty-specific research?
You're right. Research has not historically been an emphasis at DO schools. That's changing, I think. We have more funding for research now than we ever have before. We are making it a point when we're recruiting faculty to recruit faculty who are interested in doing research. So I think we're doing everything we can to change that. And I think the majority of students that are interested in kind of hands-on clinical research can find some opportunities. The most important thing I would say is start early, take the initiative. Don't wait till the very end of, the end of the year, right before summer, and just kind of anonymously put your name out there that you'd like to do research. Because by then everyone's labs are filling up rapidly and we're just swamped. And from a practical sense, there's only so many students you can take in your lab at one time. If you take too many, you're just denying everyone a research opportunity. The other thing is to keep your mind open about what kind of research you want to do. It's great if your real interest is in liver transplant, but the reality is you probably aren't going to find a lab doing liver transplant work. Get something similar enough and close enough, maybe even a lab that allows you to tailor a project that you can do some real research.
Okay, that was very helpful. And would you say that the type of research a medical student takes matter?
For the most part, no, I don't think it matters. The most important thing is that you accomplish something in the research, that you have a recognizable product. And by that, I mean, the only goal you should really be thinking about is a peer-reviewed paper.
Okay.
If what you end up with is a little letter saying, I did research over the summer, that's not going to be very competitive when you go looking for rotation slots and everything else. Likewise, giving a poster somewhere. And that's nice, and I applaud it, but you want to be able to do more than that. Now, you can do research in medical education. You can do, clinical research. You could do hands-on bench research. There's all sorts of different forms. The most important thing, though, in my opinion, is to make sure that the program you're working in is really tailored towards peer-reviewed publication. That's for your benefit. Now, that being said, if you are going for some of the real competitive subdisciplines, like, say, neurosurgery, you're going to want to be doing work in that field as soon as you possibly can. You're going to have a hard time competing for those kind of rotation slots if you've been doing medical education research.
And a follow-up question. For some listeners who might not know the difference between bench work versus clinical research, could you define what both of them are?
Well, I think there's a lot of variations in all of it. So you can do research on something like different ways to teach gross anatomy. And you would do survey work, you would contact different institutions, you'd look at student performance. There's a lot of different forms of research in medical education that you could get involved in. Benchtop research or basic research, goes by a lot of different names, is the kind of work I do in my lab. So I'm not doing anything with human patients. Sometimes it's done just on chemicals. Sometimes it's done on laboratory animals. It depends on the exact nature of the question. Clinical work is either done in conjunction with a clinician on patients, or it's looking at medical records, data sets. How effective are standalone clinics versus treatment at hospital? This kind of research.
What advice can you give to students who may not enjoy research, but are concerned about matching successfully into a specialty?
I would say treat it as a course you may not enjoy. It's important to do, particularly if you're looking for a specialty. You're going to need it. So I would suggest be careful about the lab you're in. Lab work is very personality driven, right? Make sure you're working with someone you can get along with, that you have a clear understanding of the goals and the objectives of what you're doing and the demands. And then at some point, you've just got to deal with it.
Okay. And in your opinion, what is more valuable, a higher number of publications or a greater number of poster presentations?
So publications, without a doubt.
Okay.
Peer-reviewed publications are the coin of the realm. Posters are much easier to put together. They're much easier to present. They are, without a doubt, a lower category of research output. I think they're a great opportunity for students to do. I try to ensure that all the students working with me do posters at our IBRS and sometimes beyond our IBRS. So I don't mean to belittle a poster, but there's no question that a peer-reviewed publication is viewed higher than a poster.
How many would you tell them to aim for?
I think that really depends on what kind of specialty they want to go into and how competitive the rest of their dossier is. I mean, my last student who's doing neurosurgery now, I think ended up with 5 pubs, and he was, fortunately for him, competitive and got the rotations and everything he was looking for. That's a big number. If you've got 1 or 2 or 3, you should be able to get your foot in the door.
Okay. And for non-competitive specialties, can students do with not doing research at all? Can they get away with it?
I think right now that probably still true. I don't think that's going to be the case in the future, because even what we consider as non-competitive, there's a lot of competition for rotation sites. They're not as hard to get as if you're going into something like neurosurgery or transplant surgery, but there's still competition. If you want to be able to ensure that you have your pick of sites, which doesn't happen very often, you've got to do everything you can to be competitive. And research is one thing that will definitely make you stand out.
Oh, okay. One last question. What tips do you have for excelling in research during medical school?
Well, I think there's two things that are important. Number one, you've got to commit to it. It's work. There's no question about it. If it's something that you're going to try to just skate by on the side while you're doing all your classes, I mean, the worst thing that can happen is that you do a little research, you get a publication, and you aren't really integrated into the publication. You aren't very familiar with it, because when you go out for an interview, they're going to ask you about it. If you can't talk about your own publication in detail, you lose an awful lot of credibility and standing, frankly. So you've got to be committed to the work you're doing. You've also got to be careful that the fit is right. I mean, you should enjoy it. You should enjoy working with the other people in the lab. You should enjoy the basics of what you're doing. I understand that some people may feel kind of compelled to do it, and there may be only limited slots and they have to go here, even though they would have rather been there. Make the best of it. Again, I view it as a class that you don't really like, but you understand is board relevant. So you've got to master the material, whether you're particularly thrilled with it or not.
That is very helpful. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to interview you. I'm pretty sure a lot of us will find this very useful.
My pleasure.
Thank you.